In the winter of 1944, a German officer stationed near the Vosges Mountains sat down to write a letter home. He had just survived an engagement he described, and this is the precise word he used, as unnatural, not difficult, not costly, unnatural. He wrote that the Americans who came through the tree line that morning moved the way no soldiers he had ever faced moved before. They didn't advance, they erupted. He told his wife he believed, in that moment, that the war had changed its rules without informing the German army. He never named the unit. He didn't need to. Every soldier in his sector already knew. They were the men of the 761st Tank Battalion. They were black Americans, and for the first year of their existence as a combat unit, the United States Army itself wasn't sure it wanted them at the front. That is the hidden structure of this story. Not simply a tale of battlefield valor, though the valor was extraordinary. Not simply a story of racism overcome, though the racism was real and documented and almost destroyed them before they fired a single shot in anger. This is a story about what happens when you deny men the right to prove themselves for so long that, when the gate finally opens, the force that comes through is beyond what anyone imagined. It is a story told most accurately not through American military reports, which minimized what the 761st accomplished for decades, but through the voices of the men who were trying to stop them. German soldiers, German officers, German records. The enemy, as it turns out, kept far more honest books. The 761st Tank Battalion earned a nickname from the Germans they fought. Not a nickname given in mockery, a nickname given in the specific, grudging language that soldiers use when they have no other explanation for what they witnessed. The Germans called them Die Schwarzen Panther, the Black Panthers. And when you understand the context in which that name was spoken, the weight it carried, you begin to understand what actually happened in the forests and frozen fields of France and Belgium and Germany between November 1944 and May 1945. But to understand the Black Panthers, you first have to understand the machinery of doubt that was built around them before they ever reached Europe. The 761st Tank Battalion was activated on the 1st of April 1942 at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana. From the very first day, the men understood their situation with perfect clarity. They were training to fight for a country that would not let them sit at the same lunch counter as the white soldiers they trained beside. They were learning to operate Sherman tanks worth $40,000 in facilities that would not allow them to use the same bathrooms as their white counterparts. Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, in 1942, was not a subtle environment. The hostility was institutional, bureaucratic, and sometimes violent. There were documented incidents of white military police beating black soldiers on base. Local civilians threatened men who ventured off post. The message was clear, repeated daily, written into the architecture of the place itself. And yet they trained, with a ferocity and a precision that their white commanding officers found, depending on the officer, either admirable or threatening. They trained because many of them had made a private calculation. That excellence on a battlefield was the only currency that could not be denied. That if they were extraordinary enough, history would have to record what they did. That their sons would inherit a different country. This was not naive, it was strategic. And it was, in the end, correct, though the timeline was longer and bloodier than any of them hoped. The commanding officer who would eventually lead them into combat arrived in 1943. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates was a white officer who had specifically requested command of a black unit. A request considered, within certain army circles, evidence of poor judgment or worse. Bates was not a crusader in any theatrical sense. He was a tank commander who understood that the 761st, given proper training and genuine leadership, could be devastatingly effective. He ran them hard. He demanded what the army had not demanded, because the army's unofficial position was that the 761st would never see real combat. They were a demonstration unit, a symbol, something to point at when questions arose about black Americans in the fighting force. Bates refused this framework entirely. He ran them as if they would fight. He ran them as if their lives depended on it, which they would. And in doing so, he created something the army bureaucracy had not intended. He created a battalion that was ready. The problem was that readiness alone was not sufficient. For 2 years, the 761st trained, certified, and trained again. They completed qualification courses that many white units failed. Their maintenance records were exceptional, yet inspecting officers recommended further training rather than deployment. The word that appears again and again in those reports is premature. It was never premature for white units with comparable or lesser qualification scores. The word was doing specific work, and the men of the 761st understood exactly what that work was. By the fall of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a moment of controlled desperation. The Allied advance out of Normandy had stalled at the German border. Eisenhower's armies were stretched across hundreds of miles of front, undersupplied, approaching winter, and facing a German defense that had reconstituted faster than anyone predicted. George Patton's Third Army, driving hard toward Germany through eastern France, needed armored support. He needed it now, and someone finally sent him the 761st. The meeting between Patton and the 761st on the 2nd of November 1944 has been described many times, but the descriptions tend to flatten it into a single memorable sentence. Patton told the assembled men he didn't care what color they were, he only cared that they could kill Germans. What is less often noted is the context. Patton was not delivering motivation to men who needed it. He was performing a political ritual for his own command structure, reassuring them that he had properly assessed the unit. The men of the 761st did not need Patton's blessing. They had been ready for 2 years. What they needed was the opportunity he was finally providing. 4 days later, on the 6th of November 1944, near the town of Moyen-Moutier in the Vosges Mountains of northeastern France, the 761st Tank Battalion entered combat for the first time. The Vosges Mountains in November are a specific kind of hostile. The trees are old-growth pine, so dense at the canopy level that the daylight arrives filtered and grey, giving the forest floor a permanent twilight quality. The ground is soft from autumn rains but hardening toward frost, creating conditions where tracked vehicles sink unpredictably and infantry lose their footing on slopes that look gradual from a distance but become treacherous in contact. The temperature that morning was just above freezing. The fog that had settled in the valleys the night before had not fully lifted. Visibility in the forest was measured in meters, not in the hundreds. The German units defending this sector were elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, veterans of the Eastern Front who had been refitting and defending prepared positions for weeks. Their assessment of what they faced, drawn from aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations, was that they would encounter inexperienced American armored support, likely held in reserve throughout the engagement, with infantry doing the primary work of clearing the forest positions. This was the standard American approach in such terrain. Tanks didn't operate effectively in dense forest. Every German commander in the Vosges knew this. What happened instead is recorded in the after-action reports of the 17th SS with a specificity that suggests the authors were trying to document something they themselves didn't fully understand. The tanks came through the trees. Not around the forest, not pausing at the tree line to provide fire support for dismounted infantry. Through the trees. The 761st's tank commanders had developed, in their 2 years of training, techniques for operating in forested terrain that the Army's official doctrine didn't fully account for. They used the tanks as battering rams, as fire support platforms in impossibly close quarters, as psychological weapons. A Sherman tank, emerging from fog and pine at a range of 30 meters, does not give a defending infantryman time to think. It gives him time only to react. And if his reaction is wrong, by a single second, that is the end of his contribution to the war. Private First Class William McBurney, from New York City, was in the 3rd tank to breach the German line that morning. He would later describe what the inside of that tank felt like in the first minutes of contact. Like being inside a drum while someone beat it with a hammer. Beneath all that noise and vibration, he said, was something he could only describe as clarity. Every decision narrowed to the essential. Move or stop, shoot or hold. The complexity of his entire life, everything he carried from New York, from the segregated army, from 2 years of being told he wasn't ready, compressed into a single operational present tense that demanded nothing but his absolute best. He gave it. They all gave it. By the end of that first day, the 761st had penetrated the German defensive line at Moyen-Mortier and advanced 3 kilometers into positions the 17th SS had considered secure. German casualty reports for that engagement describe the attacking force in terms that the authors clearly struggled to fit their existing framework. One officer wrote that the American tankers seemed indifferent to the normal tactical constraints governing armored operations. He meant this as a tactical observation. It was also, without his intending it, an accurate psychological description of men who had spent 2 years being told what they couldn't do. The following weeks produced a rhythm of combat that tested the 761st in ways that training could only approximate. The Vosges campaign required sustained operations in terrain that punished mistakes with extraordinary speed. The battalion suffered casualties. Not light casualties. Men they had trained with for 2 years, men they knew by first name, by hometown, by the particular way they laughed, died in those mountains. And then they continued. This is the part of the story that military historians sometimes underweight, because it is harder to quantify than a kilometer gained or a position taken. The capacity to sustain losses and continue operating at high effectiveness is not simply a matter of training or doctrine. It is a matter of what soldiers are fighting for. The men of the 761st were fighting for the country that had mistreated them, but also for something more precise, a record that could not be denied. They were fighting for their men to their left and right. They were fighting for their fathers, who had served in the First World War and returned to a country that greeted black veterans with renewed violence. This is documented. It is expressed in letters home and post-war accounts with a consistency that removes any ambiguity. And it produced on the battlefield a fighting quality the German army found itself unable to categorize. The name Die Schwarzen Panther did not emerge from a single moment. It accumulated. It grew from reports moving up through German command chains, each adding a detail, a specific incident, a notation of some quality that didn't fit the standard profile of American armored units. By December of 1944, German soldiers in sectors facing the 761st were telling each other about the Black Panthers the way soldiers tell each other about things that frighten them. In compressed, specific language, stripped of anything that might sound like superstition, but carrying exactly its weight. A German corporal named Heinrich Beistow, from Dortmund, wrote in his diary, recovered after the war, that you could tell when the Black Panthers were in your sector by the speed of the advance. No other American unit moved quite that way. It was not recklessness, he wrote. It was something more controlled than recklessness, and that made it harder to counter. The Battle of the Bulge began on the 16th of December, 1944. Germany launched its last great offensive through the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg, intent on splitting the Allied line, capturing the port of Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace. In retrospect, a desperate gamble. In the first days, it did not look desperate. It looked like it might work. Entire American divisions were encircled or shattered. Bastogne was surrounded. The weather grounded Allied air power. And Patton's Third Army, driving east, received orders to turn 90 degrees north. One of the most complex staff planning operations of the war, executed in days. The 761st was part of that turn. They moved north in conditions that combined the worst elements of winter warfare. Temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius on the worst nights. Snow that looked pristine from a distance was, on the ground, ice and mud that resisted movement in every direction. Tanks threw treads on roads that should have been passable. And above all of this, the German army was fighting with the ferocity of men who knew what they were defending was not a position but the last viable offensive option their country possessed. The 761st fought through December and January in conditions that broke other units, not metaphorically, literally broke them, as in units that had to be withdrawn for reconstitution because they had taken casualties beyond the point of operational effectiveness. The 761st was not withdrawn, it continued, its casualty rates were significant, and its operational tempo remained high. German after-action reports from this period note, repeatedly, that the armored unit designated in their intelligence files by the Black Panthers identifier did not exhibit the degradation in effectiveness typically observed in units operating under sustained winter conditions. One German staff officer wrote, with the careful language of military bureaucracy that somehow makes the observation more striking, that the unit appeared to maintain tactical cohesion under pressure that exceeded standard parameters. He was trying to say they would not break. He was correct. Sergeant Reuben Rivers from Tecumseh, Oklahoma, is the name that has come to define something essential about what the 761st accomplished and what it cost. Rivers was a tank commander of exceptional ability, a man whose physical courage was remarked upon by virtually everyone who served with him. In November of 1944, during the fighting near Goebling in the Moselle region of France, Rivers's tank struck a mine that tore open the hull and wounded him severely. The wound was to his leg, and the nature of the injury was such that any medical officer who examined him would have ordered him immediately to the rear for treatment. Rivers refused evacuation. He refused it, not impulsively, but deliberately, understanding what refusing meant in terms of his own survival odds. He said that his crew needed him. He said that the mission needed him. He stayed. He continued to command his tank in combat for 3 days with a wound that should have removed him from the battle. His actions during those 3 days were documented by multiple witnesses. He directed his tank into German positions to relieve pressure on dismounted infantry. He continued to operate under direct fire with a clarity and effectiveness that his crewmates, who knew he was wounded, found extraordinary. On the 19th of November, his tank was hit again. This time, the hit was fatal. Reuben Rivers died in the tank he had refused to leave. His commander, Captain David Williams, submitted a recommendation for the Medal of Honor for Rivers's actions. The recommendation was denied. The reason given, filtered through the Army's administrative process, was insufficient documentation. The same standard was not applied uniformly to white soldiers in comparable circumstances, a fact that historians have since documented with considerable precision. Rivers did not receive the Medal of Honor in 1944. He did not receive it in 1945. He did not receive it in 1946, or in any year of the decade that followed. He received it in 1997, 52 years after his death. President Clinton presented it posthumously, alongside 6 other black soldiers whose awards had been similarly delayed. The Army's own investigation, conducted in the 1990s, concluded that systemic racial bias had prevented the proper recognition of black soldiers during World War II. This is the official, documented conclusion of the United States Army about its own conduct. Reuben Rivers was 23 years old when he died. The tactical significance of what the 761st accomplished in the Rhineland campaign of early 1945 has been debated by military historians for decades, with the debate itself revealing the underlying discomfort of the historical record. American military records from this period systematically undercount the contributions of black units, a pattern driven by the same administrative tendency that suppressed Rivers's Medal of Honor. After-action reports credit white units with positions and advances that cross-reference German records and survivor accounts attribute, at least in part, to the 761st. The German records are more straightforward. The enemy had no institutional reason to minimize the effectiveness of the Black Panthers. Minimizing enemy effectiveness does not serve military analysis. German reports from January and February of 1945 discuss the unit with the flat functional respect that competent professionals give to competent opponents. A captured German officer, interrogated in February of 1945, was asked directly about the Black Panthers. He said that in his sector, the appearance of that unit in the American order of battle was treated as a tactical indicator that required response. What he meant was that German commanders, when they knew the 761st was in front of them, made specific preparations they did not make for other American armored units. They requested additional anti-tank assets. They repositioned defensive lines. They told their men what was coming. This is what it means, in military terms, to be taken seriously as a threat. The crossing of the Rhine River in March of 1945 marked the moment when the German army's capacity for sustained defense began to finally disintegrate. The 761st crossed into Germany itself. There is an irony here that none of the men missed. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 and the American Jim Crow laws of the same period shared a family resemblance that German legal scholars had studied and partially admired. They were driving tanks into the heartland of an ideology their own country had partially replicated. Several of the men had written about it in letters their families preserved for decades. They crossed anyway, because the mission was the mission, and because whatever their country had failed to be, what they were doing in that moment was right. The final weeks of the war in Europe produced the deepest wound in the 761st's history, and it was not a battlefield wound. On the 4th of May 1945, elements of the battalion were among the American forces that arrived at a subcamp of the Gunskirchen concentration camp complex in Austria. What they found there is documented in written accounts of multiple soldiers who were present. William McBurney, the tank crewman from New York City, who had been in the 3rd tank through the German line at Moyen-Moutier 6 months earlier, wrote about it in terms that stripped away every rhetorical device he had previously employed. He wrote that he understood, standing at that gate, that the war had been about something more fundamental than anything he had named to himself before. The people inside looked at him and at his fellow black soldiers with an expression he could not interpret at first, and then understood. They were looking at men who came from the direction of freedom. Every man coming through that gate was, in their eyes, the face of rescue. McBurney wrote that he had spent 3 years being told he was not quite American enough, not quite ready. Standing at that gate, he understood that America, whatever its failures, had produced him and his battalion, and they had ended up exactly where they needed to be. The 761st Tank Battalion was recommended for a Presidential Unit Citation in 1945. The recommendation sat in Army files for 30 years. It was finally awarded in 1978 after a sustained campaign by veterans who spent 3 decades doing what soldiers denied recognition always have to do, making noise until someone listened. By 1978, many of the men who had earned that citation were dead. The historical minimization of what the 761st accomplished was not accidental. American military history, as written in the immediate post-war years, was authored primarily by and for the white institutions that conducted the war. Black units appeared as footnotes, as human interest elements that could be invoked when convenient and ignored when inconvenient. The 761st's 6 months of continuous combat, their advance across 5 countries, their role in defeating German defensive lines that held against other units was compressed in the official record into a few paragraphs. The German record is different. German veterans who faced the 761st spoke about them with a consistency and specificity that is in its way the most reliable testimony available. They had nothing to gain from exaggerating the effectiveness of the unit that had defeated them. They had no institutional incentive to credit black American soldiers with extraordinary capability. What they said because it matched what they had experienced. A German tank commander, Hans-Peter Wolff, who survived the war and was interviewed by American historians in the 1970s, was asked about the Black Panthers. He said that in his experience, the quality of an opposing force was measured not by what they did when conditions were favorable, but by what they did when conditions were favorable, but by what they did when conditions were worst. He said the Black Panthers had no bad days. He meant this literally in every engagement his unit had with the 761st, regardless of weather, terrain, casualty level, or the state of the broader battle, the unit performed at the same high level. He said that consistency was rarer than any individual act of bravery. No bad days. From November 1944 to May 1945, 6 months, 5 countries. Sustained combat operations against a German army that was fighting for its existence. The men who produced that record came from the south side of Chicago, and from Harlem, and from small towns in Alabama and Oklahoma and Texas. They came from the America that had told them, with extraordinary specificity, what their ceiling was. They had the education that segregated schools provided and the opportunities that Jim Crow permitted. They trained at bases where they were treated as second-class soldiers. They were deployed only when the army ran out of other options. They were recognized only when veterans who refused to be erased finally forced the record to be corrected. And they gave the German army no bad days. What the 761st Tank Battalion accomplished in World War II is not a story about overcoming the odds, though they did. It is not a story about black excellence, though it was that too. It is a story about what human beings are capable of when they have been denied recognition long enough to understand, at a cellular level, that excellence is not requested. It is claimed. It is demonstrated in the specific irreversible language of action, until the record cannot be written any other way. The German officer who wrote home in the winter of 1944, the one who said the war had changed its rules without informing the German army, understood something essential. He didn't know the history of the men who had just torn through his defensive line. He didn't know about Camp Claiborne, or the denied Medal of Honor, or the 30-year wait for a unit citation. He just knew what he had seen. And what he had seen was this: soldiers who fought as if they were answering a question that had been put to them long before the battle started. Soldiers who could not afford to be anything less than extraordinary, because ordinary had never been an option they were offered. The Black Panthers answered that question in the forests of the Vosges, in the frozen fields of the Ardennes, on the banks of the Rhine, and at the gates of Gunskirchen. They answered it in a language that required no translation and admitted no denial. They answered it in the only way that has ever actually worked, with the undeniable fact of what they did.